Hi, producer Jonah here, just letting you know that this episode contains discussion about sexual acts and imagery.
Welcome to the Principle of Charity. I'm Lloyd Vogelman and I'm here with my cousin and buddy Emil Sherman. We're here to inject some generosity and curiosity back into our conversations. Principle of Charity tells us to seek the truth, not win the fight. In fact, we start the podcast asking each of our guests to present the most generous version of the other's viewpoint. Emil will then lead a conversation with the guests exploring what they really think, and later I'll focus some more on the principle of charity itself. Our topic today is there good pornography or is it inherently demeaning to women? Emil, tell us a little bit more.
Thanks, Lloyd. So, is there good pornography or is it inherently demeaning to women? Pornography is probably the most pervasive but under discussed topic out there. It's such a massive industry with so many people consuming porn. But unlike the latest Netflix series, for most people, it's not something we chat about that openly. Here are some stats to help you get your head around the size of this industry. 12% of all internet content is porn, with 35% of all internet downloads estimated to be porn related. Porn sites receive more regular traffic than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined each month. MindGeek, which owns Pornhub and other massive sites, is one of the top 3 bandwidth consuming companies in the world, the other 2 being Google and Netflix. The industry is estimated to be worth $97 billion worldwide. With the internet as the home of porn, there's no real barrier to entry for young people to access porn. So, in fact, 64% of young people aged 13 to 24 actively seek out pornography weekly or more often. And a third of those porn users are female. So, is pornography a healthy form of sexual expression, exploration, and enjoyment for all these people, and a thriving industry of empowered performers? Or is pornography exploitative, demeaning, and ultimately destructive to our intimate relationships, even sometimes promoting violence against women? And do some of these themes also apply to our culture at large, where the line between pornography and sexualized imagery is often blurred? We're going to explore all of this and more with our exceptional guests. Who are they, Lloyd?
Our two guests today, Emil, are Catharine Lumby and Clive Hamilton. Catharine Lumby is a professor of media at Macquarie University and a frequent media commentator across print, radio, and television. Catharine is also the author of 6 books, including Bad Girls, The Media, Sex, and Feminism. Clive Hamilton is a professor of public ethics at Charles Sturt University in Canberra. Clive has held various visiting academic positions, including at Oxford and Yale. He was the executive director of the think tank, the Australian Institute. Clive is also a prolific author, and his opinions are published widely, including in the New York Times and the Scientific American. The thing that we are going to explore today is that both Catharine and Clive have definitely crossed swords in the media many times in the past, disagreeing with each other on whether porn has a place in a healthy sexual diet. But this is the first time they've had a proper conversation. But before we bring on the guests, I want to remind the audience that we will first be asking Catharine to present the most generous version of Clive's viewpoint, and then vice versa. After that, Emil will explore their real views. Emil, let's bring on the guests.
Welcome, Kathy and Clive. Let's start with you, Kathy. How would you articulate the strongest version of Clive's view that pornography is demeaning to women?
I understand Clive's position as being certainly not a religiously conservative and not a radical feminist position which argues that all heterosexual sex is rape, but rather a position that is very concerned for women and young people and worries that pornography demeans and objectifies women in and of itself, that perhaps it constitutes a kind of hate speech, that pornography and Clive acknowledges that there are many forms of pornography because pornography is not one thing, but that it is increasingly in the online age full of really horrific, sometimes very misogynistic, violent, demeaning sorts of behaviours. and that people younger and younger are getting access to this, and that this may influence, in particular, young male attitudes towards women and encourage the dehumanising and objectifying of women, which we know is a problem, and I believe Clive is concerned about it being a problem, as we know that we have an epidemic of domestic violence and sexual assault in this country that largely, but not only, affects women.
Is that the most sympathetic of the viewpoints which say that there's a problem with pornography? The one that you say that Clive's articulating.
And I don't entirely disagree with the view. This is the thing. I completely understand where it comes from. I think of all the people that I could be in a discussion with about this, Clive's the person who I probably understand or have more empathy and sympathy for his viewpoint than anyone else, because I think it's coming from a man who's thought profoundly about ethics, and I think a man who cares deeply about the treatment of women and has thought deeply about the human condition and what does it mean to express human sexuality in a way that allows us all to be fully human.
Before we get into the meat of it, Clive, and we're going to have plenty of chance for you to articulate your own position, absolutely fully. But how would you articulate the viewpoint that is, I guess, pro-pornography in the most general sense, but the most sympathetic viewpoint that you relate most strongly with?
Well, rather than that, let me try to do something very similar, but present as I can the most generous version of Cathy's standpoint. Okay. And like Cathy's gone back, obviously, in preparation for this to read what I've written. So have I, and it's been really interesting because I haven't written or really thought in much depth about the question for quite a few years now. So let me see if I can present a position that Cathy might agree with. So I made a few notes here. So pornography, or it's perhaps better described as erotica, is a legitimate and often helpful expression of the wide variety of human sexuality. And by showing a diversity of sexual practices, it reflects the diversity of real life, which has often been denied, causing some people to feel ashamed of their preferences or their orientations. In particular, women's sexual expression has been historically denied or distorted, with women ashamed to pursue the full expression of their sexual desires. And pornography helps to normalise their desires and give permission to explore them. Suppression of pornography is in a long line of denying or suppressing and distorting sexuality as such, especially the obliteration of women's sexuality. So access to pornography is a further and necessary extension of the sexual revolution that began in the 60s, liberating sex from the fears and hang-ups of previous generations. Gay sexuality and various forms of non-mainstream sexual expression, like BDSM and even interracial sex, are no longer stigmatized in the way they were, and that can only be a good thing. Forms of sexual expression that society deems acceptable, they change over time and across cultures. As the history of book bans and obscenity trials shows, decisions to suppress or ban obscene works are likely to become outdated, and they later appear to be narrow-minded and open to ridicule. And we now see those bans as products of taboos that are socially constructed and probably the expression of the power of one social group over others. And the history of attempts to outlaw homosexuality is a good case in point. Erotica dates back to ancient civilizations, as we know. Some books and films that have been banned in the past, and even paintings and sculptures, are now recognised for what they truly are, that is, works of art. So attitudes change. Right and wrong are cultural constructs, and we ought not to allow one group's personal moral preferences to be imposed on others that don't share them. And when you ask porn users, adults, they say they obviously approve, and they say that access to pornography actually enhances their sexual lives. For young people, where the issue becomes more difficult, young people, for those young people whose desires and preferences deviate from the standard hetero norm, access to pornography has been liberating. Young gay and lesbian youths experiencing the anxiety and the fear of being different can discover from online porn that they're not outcasts who should be ashamed of their same-sex attraction. Some people, like me, worry about what teenagers are exposed to online. But if teenagers obtain pleasure from looking at porn on the internet, then that's to be encouraged or at least accepted, isn't it? It's all part of learning about sex and sexuality. Sure, there are some unsavoury genres of porn out there, but to find them, you really have to go looking for them because it's unlikely any teens would stumble upon them. And so mainstream porn, which is what most kids see and are interested in, is what men and women do every day. And there's no good reason to deny teenagers the pleasure and educational value that porn can bring to their sexual lives.
Wow. Well, I'm sold.
Okay, can you write my next book, Clive?
Wow.
Very
Lloyd,
good.
on the charity barometer.
Okay, well, I'm gonna the charity barometer. You're gonna have to ask me. What are some of the criteria for the charity barometer? And I'm gonna go. Well, one of the criteria for the charity barometer is do we do our best to understand what another person's argument is. So I'm gonna give Clive a 9, and I'm gonna give Kathy an 8. One of the things about the principle of charity, which I think Kathy and Clive did incredibly, was actually to show respect to the opponent as a person, and it's not the assumption that we're smarter than anyone else. And I sort of felt that in both presentations. So fantastic to both of you.
Well,
Brilliant.
It does set up the stakes of the podcast as being one about conversation and generosity rather than combat. Let's stay with you, Kathy, and your argument, essentially, which Clive's partly articulated. Where did you think that he largely encompassed your thoughts, and how would you further, elaborate your feelings?
No, I think he captured it perfectly. That's why I made the joke about he should write my next book. Not that I'm writing about pornography anymore, and Clive doesn't seem to be either, right? But look, I'm not an advocate of pornography, and I know Clive was not saying I was at all, right? I recognise that he's really articulated and understood my argument, and I really thank him for that. I think that one of Clive's concerns that I've detected in going back and reading his writing, and I have read pretty much everything Clive's written because, as I said formerly, I respect Clive's thoughts in many directions, is that at times, and I went back and found a piece you'd written for the Sydney Morning Herald, Clive, where you referred to me as a libertarian postmodern ironist or something, and I'm sure it was just a rhetorical flourish, but like you, Clive, I take the sexual assault of women and men very, very seriously. And in fact, I've devoted 3 decades of my life majorly pro bono, working with Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia. I've worked with the Rugby League for this reason. I grew up as a working class girl in Newcastle. I witnessed domestic violence growing up, not involving my father, I hasten to say, but in many other families. And I personally experienced sexual assault as a child. And so these are matters of grave concern to me. And they are matters of grave concern when it comes to, and I have 2 sons, one of whom's trans, who of course necessarily have been exposed to pornography on the internet. So what I want to unpack here, and what I really would like to hear Clive's response to, is that my approach with raising these 2 kids has been to talk openly and deeply to them about what misogyny looks like, but also about the importance of female agency and sexual pleasure. And so not this free, I guess I get the sense sometimes that Clive and other progressive thinkers think that my generation, the sort of so-called postmodernist generation, think anything goes, it's all fine, the kids are all right. And I don't think that at all, except that my approach would be to open conversations with them and engage them rather than to censor. So I'd be really interested to hear what Clive's got to say about that, because it's something I grapple with morally and ethically.
Well, okay. Well, that's you
Well,
feel like that your position's been articulated enough, Cathy, either between yourself or Clive, and
Oh,
let's
I
move
think
on to Clive's thoughts.
I thought Clive did really, really well. So
Yeah.
thank you, Clive.
Yeah. Okay.
Emil, can I just jump in there for
Yeah.
1 second because I'm feeling a little confused. Just Cathy, if you could just maybe elucidate your statement that you're not advocating porn
No.
in your book, Bad Girls.
Mm.
There is a chapter entitled "Why Feminists Need Porn." Can you just sort of
I'll unpack
explain?
that. Oh, sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
And look, it was probably a needlessly provocative title. Listen, I wrote that book in my mid-30s in New York.
Right.
So, you know,
Okay.
one gives things silly titles at that age.
Mm.
But what I was saying is that at this, in the feminist movement, which I've been hugely part of, and I think I was a feminist when I was born, there's been this return to the subject of pornography almost obsessively. It feels to me like if you call it like a blister on the skin of pornography, it's something that's hot and sore to touch that we need to scratch.
Right.
And it seems to me that it's often the cart before the horse.
But fundamentally, Cathy, as I understand it, you see, and there was a legitimate view of seeing certain pornography as a healthy part of a sexual diet.
I do, certain pornography, anything that is attempting to just use women as sexual currency purely or demean anyone on the basis of ability or race or any other things, I dislike and I have a problem with. But I think if we talk about what sexual desire looks like, is that we do objectify people during sex. Women do it, men do it. It doesn't matter who they're having sex with, and that pornography is a kind of an expression of that way that desire flows like water between rocks, and it's hard to contain, and that we fantasize that's part of our sexual humanity. But it doesn't mean that we should hurt. I mean, for me, the main questions with sex or sexuality is it safe, consensual, and ethical?
Well, let's jump onto that in a bit after we've heard from Clive, because I think it is those lines of what constitutes consent, when is something expressive, and when is it actually objectification. So, Clive, what do you really think?
Yeah, well, I think consent is presented as a very easy concept. You say yes or no, but human beings are a lot more complicated than that. And so my main problem with the how can I put that, kind of pro porn people, let's say, which may or may not include Cathy, is the way in which, and you look at the sex industry, for example, the way in which there are silos established, and there's mainstream, acceptable, nice, clean, healthy porn over here, and there's some unpleasant, exploitative, violent, horrible stuff over there. And it's kind of, we wish that horrible stuff weren't there, but we're just going to focus on the good stuff. Now, my view is that if men and women want to use healthy, consensual porn as a way of enhancing their sexual lives, alone or together, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. I've never advocated censorship of it or restriction of it. But you can't keep the silos separate. The darkness leaks in to the mainstream. And that's what really concerns me. And the dark can be extremely dark indeed. Violence against women, all kinds of perverse practices and fetishes, simulated or real rapes, bestiality. I mean, these things aren't something over there. You don't have to go to the dark web to find this stuff. You just go, searching sex sites, and they will come up. And so what I'm getting at here is two things. One is let's begin with adults, the whole notion of forbidden desires. Now, certain desires may be forbidden despite the mockers for very, very good reason, and yet desire remains. And the porn industry actively cultivates forbidden desires. It wants people to break through the barriers that they impose, that they carry around. I mean, that's what markets do, isn't it? I mean, markets try to persuade us to go places we don't want to go, and for various reasons, and none more so with porn. And of course, this really becomes troublesome when we think about young people. Now, often, and certainly I know in response to the reports that the Australia Institute did way back when, one on young people and pornography and one on sexualisation of children in advertising, people accused us frequently of wanting to deny children, teenagers, let's say, healthy maturation of their sexual lives. But, I think if we all think back to our own maturations, it's not, it should be a step-by-step exploration of sexual possibilities when, we can go further when we're comfortable with the stage that we've got to, and if a partner is involved, that our partner is comfortable with, and then go to the next stage if there is another stage. But when we think about what teenagers, and of course kids younger than teenagers, 7-year-olds are increasingly common in the schoolyard, these kids don't go through a maturation process where they're exposed to kind of normal, man on woman sex, what your parents do in the bedroom, what you imagine or Playboy stuff, which is so kind of out of date now, it's trivial. They've got it thrust, the whole gamut, the dark, the light, the nasty, the exploitative, bang in one go. It might actually be their very first exposure. It's not uncommon to hear of 7-year-olds in the playground, innocent little kids. Some older boy typically will say, "Oh, look at this," and they'll feel compelled to look at, some act of, who knows what, you can imagine. And this can be deeply, deeply traumatizing for a child. It can completely distort their understanding of what sex and sexuality is, and they may take years to process it. But that's what the porn industry does. That's what it is. And so we can't keep those silos separately and imagine that there's a kind of nice bit that happens over here that well-meaning, well-adjusted adults expose themselves to, and there's the horrible stuff which, we'd rather not think about. That's what disturbs me about the whole industry.
Yeah. So how do we show then, Clive, the disapproval? Is it more about creating a culture or encouraging a culture, I guess, that has that doesn't approve of pornography, or is it about actually censoring pornography? There's already a lot of censorship in place. We can't get pornography, in some sites, and it's not available on Facebook and Tumblr and various sites. But what does the world look like that you'd want to create in terms of pulling the levers of incentives and laws and culture and norms?
Well, laws and culture are radically different things.
Very different.
Culture, I've written this, this has been, in a way, been my principal argument. Having been a child of the 60s, and, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but in 1971 and two or three, Jim Cairns had this kind of culture fest. What was it called? It was outside of Canberra at Brebbo, and it was kind of a mini Woodstock kind of event. And it was hot. It was the middle of summer, and there were thousands of young people out there, and we listened to music and took drugs and we walked around without any clothes on. I think, thank God there weren't any cameras around then. But, I was out there doing that stuff. So, it was all part of the liberation, and we were celebrating it, even though if many of us felt really awkward. We overcame that. So my problem is that kind of mindset is deep within our societies in the West. And it acts as an obstacle, this idea that if you attempt to impose a restriction, even a social one, on any kind of expression of sexuality, whatever it may be, then this is harking back to the bad old days of moral oppression and Mrs. Whitehouse and the whole box and dice. And I've argued, in fact, I've written a book or so about it, the Freedom Paradox in particular, that we've allowed this sense of anything goes, and any attempt to restrict what people want is in itself oppressive, to get way out of control. And there really are things that are bad for human beings. Bestiality is not morally or psychologically good for human beings. And yet you can go and see it on the internet. I imagine it's not too hard to go and find. In fact, the work that I did with Michael Flood, fortunately I wasn't the one out there doing the kind of internet field work, but he was, and he wrote a brilliant description of what actually is out there. That was 15 years ago. It certainly hasn't got any better now. So I just think that we humans are complex, difficult creatures with tremendous kind of psychological depths and complexity. And those depths and those anxieties and those neuroses and fears are exploited. And a great deal of damage can be done by not just allowing, but in a way encouraging or certainly enabling people to go to those dark places, not just kids, but adults too.
So it sounds like it's the general societal encouragement that's an issue for you. I mean, how we specifically would go about changing, that's a complex thing, but there's a feeling that you've said that came out of the 70s feminism, a libertarian view that we need to just open the boundaries, explode the walls of shame. And that sort of liberation has meant that we're in a society where paradoxically more people are exploited, in the name of liberation.
Yes, in the name of not necessarily feminism, although feminism was, of course, a critical part of it, but the broader movement of sexual liberation. And so what we advocated, Michael Flood and I think I still hold this position, although I haven't really thought hard about it for a long time, was that there are certain kinds of porn that should be, as far as we can, banned, excluded.
Right.
I mean,
and what are they?
Well, we call them extreme and violent porn, and I've named a few of them: bestiality, all kinds of sexual perversions like coprophilia, any kind of violence against women, or indeed violence against men, should be banned. I mean, you can't see them in the cinema, you can't see them on television, you can't see them in magazines. They're banned. We have laws banning.
What about, Clive, on sites like Pornhub, which are some of the biggest sites out there? You wouldn't call them extreme in that sense, but the sex that's portrayed feels like it's incredibly aggressive, it's incredibly demeaning, but yet, the actors are presumably consenting to it, and they're people who obviously derive some pleasure out of watching it, or a number of people.
Yeah.
Where do you sit on that sort of
quite hard line on this? I think if sex involves violence, then it's wrong. Sorry.
But what happens if it doesn't involve violence but is demeaning?
Well, that too. I mean, one of the common genres is cum shots. So, you've got 6 men ejaculating over a woman's face. I don't get this face thing, but, it's very, very common. And it's clearly a way of demeaning a woman, turning her into not just an object, but a kind of a vile object. So vile that you ejaculate on. I mean, it's really, that tells us something very, very dark about men, doesn't it? But it's common. And look, the woman, in that video might be perfectly consenting, which is why I say consent is a much more difficult concept than just, someone agreeing to do something or otherwise. And so, but then we get to children too. And we argued that we should do everything we can to prevent children accessing pornography. And you can have an argument about until when, 16, 17, whatever. And that's kind of all porn. And so that means, we should not mix up, as our critics always did, the desire to do something with the ability to do something. I mean, we desire to stop children, buying alcohol. The fact that we don't stop them particularly well does not mean we should abandon the laws against kids.
Cathy, can I just follow on from Clive's statement? Robert Hughes has called you the courageous libertarian. I saw that when you hear Clive talking about banning, pornography, either on the violent side or anything, even in fact that's not violent, but that could be demeaning. Where do you stand on this?
Well, I just agreed. I just mentally agreed with most of what Clive said. I mean, I would disagree on a few points, while understanding his perspective. So, I mean, firstly, yes, we agree that there is abhorrent pornography out there, and anything that involves bestiality, violence, child pornography, so forth. I mean, I think the mechanisms for banning, which was Emil's original question, and this is where my law degree kicks in here, which was unfortunately a black letter law degree from Sydney University. So everyone, please send your condolences that I had to suffer through that. But, what I know is that we have classification laws and all of these things which regulate mainstream media, but they've got nothing to do with the internet. The internet is transnational. People can change their ISP addresses, as Clive knows terribly well. You can easily get around any kind of censorship restrictions. So the idea of censoring the internet is a fantasy. I'm not, but I'm with Clive. It doesn't mean we should not do everything we can within a nation state basis and perhaps potentially in a global fora to restrict and stop the circulation of abhorrent material. And within that, I would include things like racist hate speech.
And there are other things as well, Cathy, that are not legal. They're not law forms. They're actually more societal norms or cultural approbation. There are other ways to encourage or not encourage pornography.
And I was going to that. And what I would be saying, but this is where I cared about the Safe Schools program, which was opposed by the Conservatives, where we actually start talking to children in age-appropriate ways, obviously age-appropriate, about everything from the existence of different sexualities and so on, through to the existence of pornography. And, Clive referred to, 7-year-olds in playground. Well, when my oldest was 8 years old, some older kids in the playground, exactly as Clive described, told them about something called RedTube, which is apparently like a porn version of YouTube. And strangely enough, as someone who's always described as a porn advocate, I don't watch pornography. I'm not interested in it. But my oldest and his best friend went off and used their father's laptop, and their father happens to be a professor of law at a university. And then, of course, the laptop got corrupted by spam of all this porn because these kids had gone. So the parents had to get together and have this very earnest conversation. And I said, we actually just have to talk to them. And the other parents were great, actually. We have to talk to them about, pornography and the fact that some pornography just shows what some people do consensually and safely, and some pornography, a lot of pornography, disturbingly, and Clive's right, I think it's increasingly disturbing, the amount of misogynist pornography, but not just pornography. I mean, look at the incel movement, which is hatred of women, absolutely openly displayed on the internet. It's not just pornography we have to worry about. There are forms of hate speech out there that really should concern us as progressive thinking people. And so I would say my response is education. And my response is that we have to start difficult conversations young, unfortunately. We can put internet filters on, and some of them work a bit, but by the age of 8 or 9, kids know how to get around them.
Cathy, I'd like to bring the conversation back a bit to the areas where, in a sense, there's some disagreement or where that fine line is. Because I think, in general, there's some of the more extreme forms of pornography. It's very hard to argue in favour of them, and certainly doing whatever we can with laws and with just education to make sure people, and particularly young people, understand what's happening when they're reading those images is key. But when we see more, I guess, gentler forms of pornography, or even ones that might seem demeaning, but where there's no overt aggression, is there an argument that appeals to you that it is actually a positive force? It's actually a liberating force. There is something about exploring sexuality there that is valuable for the people who maybe are doing it, but certainly for the people who are watching it. They enjoy it, and it's something that has a good place for it in an open society.
I've got, quite a few gay male friends who are married, right, in good marriages, happy, healthy marriages. and they will go out, and I go back to what Clive said before, and I know this is kind of strong, stern stuff for people to listen to, but, okay, on porn you can see 6 men ejaculate on a woman's face. Well, I know some gay men who really like it when 6 men ejaculate on their face, right? And there are some women who like that. Like, I'm a pretty vanilla kind of girl, that kind of chick, right? I like to be in a monogamous relationship, which I am, and I've always been that way. But I understand why Clive would look at that and go, that can be demeaning. But there are people who, wrote an article on group sex for the Bulletin, and I went and attended a group. There are people who are into group sex, and they do it consensually, safely, and ethically. And I went to a group sex party in Melbourne, and it was fabulous in a way to me, because their house was set up for group sex, right? And the woman worked in an ice cream factory, and the guy worked in a car manufacturing factory. They were working class people in the outer suburbs of Melbourne. And what fascinated me was I was the only person at this party with my clothes on, being the journalist, and all the other people were naked, and they were all having sex with each other. No one drank alcohol or took drugs. That was one of the rules. And they were really into a whole range of sexual practices, none of which I would want to participate in personally. But it was done safely and consensually and ethically.
Well, that's where the question of, that liberal idea or libertarian idea of consent meets some of the more ideological views, isn't it? That, there are some things in our society which we don't allow people to consent to. You can't consent to serious assault. You can't consent to selling your kidney, I don't think. There are things as a society that we don't approve of, even if individuals may choose to consent to it. Is there an element of that, moving to you, Clive, for a second, is that how you see some of the problems of consent, that you have a woman who might, or a man, but potentially a woman who's actually engaged in the industry, and they're saying they consent, but maybe they have economic choices that limit them. I mean, maybe some of them really love it and enjoy it, but maybe some don't. How do we think about consent in that context?
Well, certainly we need to think about it in a more complex way than, did they say yes? We already know that from the whole, yes means yes, no means no debate, that consent is a complex thing that it shouldn't be treated in a simple way, in the way that it does. And, if a woman consents to having 6 men ejaculate onto her face, then, I think someone should really work with her. Not, you see what I mean? I mean, human beings are complex. I mean, our psychologies are difficult. We find ourselves in situations where we feel pressured to do all kinds of things, or compelled to do all kinds of things. And so as a result of that, I mean, I'm really concerned about the way in which our society in the last, let's say, 50 years has come to regard sex and sexual pleasure and sexual expression, and the vital role of the porn industry in that, and the way that the genres and styles of porn spill into the mainstream and become normalized. And so I'm particularly concerned about the brutalization of sexual pleasure, which has become the sexual liberation and other movements of the time wanted to celebrate sex and sexuality. In fact, free expression of it was a vital component of liberation. But the porn industry and the enormous consumption of porn has led to a brutalization of sexual pleasure and the commodification of sexual desire, especially male sexual desire, so that, in a way, we've arrived at the kind of omega point of the sexual liberation movement, and we've actually lost the capacity to stand back and look at it and say, well, is this really the kind of free and healthy society that we imagined?
Kathy, is porn fundamentally a force for human flourishing? But there are some problems that we need to deal with, but overall.
I find myself agreeing with Clive more and more, right? which is why this podcast is a good podcast. Look, I don't think porn is a force for good. I think it's an expression of the messy business of being human. I think, and I come back to, again, this thing about, a woman who wants 6 men to ejaculate on her face. Some women might, actually, Clive. Like, I'm not one of those chicks, but I'm not going to judge them. And I agree with you, consent is really constrained and complicated. I find late capitalism really offensive, and I think the porn industry is definitely part of that. And yes, all of late capitalism moves towards commodification of everything and everyone, and that's a really problematic thing. And you and I foundationally agree on that. I just don't know that there aren't certain forms of porn which should be acceptable, but I also think, and I agree with you, that we need to educate young people and children young, and that means defying the conservatives on this ground and saying to them, we need to have open and honest conversations about this stuff, and that we can have disagreements on where the boundaries are.
I come from, you can hear my accent, I come from South Africa. It was a highly repressive society, not just in terms of race, but a highly repressive society in its policing dimensions, in its human rights violations, but equally in its censorship. So, and there's a society which was highly restricted, and yet women were extremely objectified. Probably, per capita, a society with one of the highest incidents of rape on the planet. People have done a lot of work on this, and I think, despite their initial views, there seems to be a sense that porn exploded in the 1990s, and yet sex crimes have decreased over time. Now, of course, we can't put one variable and just say it's that, but I'd really would like to hear from both of you. What do the empirical studies say? I mean, the principle of charity in part is trying to get to the truth.
One of the main areas that's been studied, and I should say I don't claim expertise, and probably Cathy knows a lot more, but it's just very, very hard to establish linkages between access to particularly violent porn and commission of violent acts. It is known that men who commit sexual violence do watch a lot of violent porn, but that doesn't. But as we know, correlation is not causation. It doesn't mean that watching violent porn, makes them do more of it.
And sorry, Clive, equally the opposite. A lot of men are watching violent porn who don't commit sexual violence.
No, indeed. But you have to ask yourself, if a man is not committing any sexual violence but spends a lot of time watching women have violence done against them in a sexual context, then that man has a problem, a big problem. But there are anecdotes which are significant. When we did at the Australian Institute, when we put out our report on the sexualisation of children in advertising, I wasn't an author of that. 2 young women were the authors. They got accused of being perverts because, they must look on children in DJs ads and see them in a sexual way, and therefore it's their problem, not the way they're being actually presented. When there was a legal case, we got sued for saying DJs sexualizes children in their advertising, and through a discovery process, we uncovered an email that the marketing company for DJs had sent to the photographer saying, can you make these girls, and they were a 10-year-old girl and a 12-year-old girl, that we had actually identified one ad in particular, can you make these girls look more adult and sexy? So, the marketing industry is not naive about this. But the point I wanted to make here is that in the course of that, which caused a massive uproar, and you wouldn't believe the disgusting emails that we received, particularly these young women who wrote the report received from all kinds of really unpleasant men. But I do remember a probation worker who worked in prisons telling me that pedophiles in prisons really like getting access to children's clothing catalogues. They get off on it. So you really have to take that bit of evidence seriously. even if the children's clothing catalogues aren't encouraging them to go out and commit.
Sure.
The porn industry, since it's become disrupted by technology, like a lot of other industries, has meant that a lot of power has moved back into the hands of the performers, with some of the new sites that have come up, rather than, big institutions controlling pornography. There are performers who go direct to consumer, essentially, on some of the social media platforms. And so there's a feeling in the things that I've read that they're very much empowered. They're empowered by what they're doing. They're empowered financially. They're empowered by the likes they're getting. They're able to sell their services, and they're marketing their services in terms of their images and the videos that they create very much directly to the public. And it feels, from their perspective, or a lot of their perspective, just like an incredibly empowering thing, in the same way that I might be if I decide to write a song and get it out there and find that I could commercialize it. We'll start with you, Cathy. Where do you think the power lies? Is it clear that if someone says, I feel empowered, that they are empowered, or that one can look with another lens and go, essentially you're duped? Or is that patronizing to think of somebody being duped by the subjective experience of being empowered?
Yeah, it's one of the most difficult questions ever. Because I agree with Clive about, we are in late capitalism in that stage, and I think it's a place and a time where we would like to think we have agency. I come back to this thing about the matrix, right? I'd like to think I'm outside the matrix, but maybe I've taken the wrong pill. Like,
there's no other pill since postmodernism. We're all in them. We're all inextricably in the matrix.
I want a yellow pill. Maybe
We want the yellow pill.
I want the yellow pill. But the problem is that, yes, I have argued strongly for women's agency, because one of the things that I found, from a young age, very difficult, is women being put on a pedestal. And that includes women not having sexual agency. And that's a very, a Judeo-Christian view of women and their bodies, which offended me from a young age, right? On the other hand, I understand, as Clive understands, that there is a commodification and a capitalisation, if you like, of sexuality and women's bodies in particular. So I would say that that's an almost impossible question to answer. I think we just have to work at agency. I think agency is something we never know if we have. And I think Clive has also raised really important questions in this conversation about the complexities of consent. And I completely agree with him on that. I've thought deeply about what consent means in my life. So how do we, any of us, really know what we're consenting to a lot of the time, ethically speaking?
It does seem that it is quite a core question, which is the question that people with different views turn around, which is, if somebody feels and says very articulately that they feel empowered by an expression, whether it's just a more broad pornographication of culture where people are just a lot more open with their nudity now on TikTok and other forms of social media. But when people feel empowered by these things, do we fundamentally trust their subjective experience and validate it? And, Lloyd, when I was speaking with your daughter who's in her 20s, she said the norm now is to feel like pornography is an incredibly empowering thing for women. And so that subjective experience is something that we have to take very seriously. But Clive, it's not the end of the story, is it?
Not at all. I mean, and I've always had a problem with this pornography empowers women argument when you're talking about, for the most part, an industry that's controlled by men, that displays men exercising power over women. Now, you just look at the language that's used. It's a language of domination and debasement. And not all porn is like that. There is some porn that is kind of female-oriented and so on. But what worries me about this is that, again, coming back to younger people, I mean, what if an 18-year-old, you're talking about women, people taking control of their pornographic experience as a producer of porn away from the industry itself, the whole amateur porn genre. But what does it mean for an 18-year-old girl, let's say, who posts videos of herself having sex? Normal ways, all kinds of, I'll be pilloried for that, all kinds of ways, and, does it several times, and there it is forever. What if it's a 16-year-old who says she's 18, who posts very, very graphic clips of her having sex with whatever? Is that empowered? Is that agency, or is that really a very dangerous manifestation of the kind of Kardashianization of youth culture? Which is an intense celebration, even a deification of the body, and the body understood as the place of sexual pleasure. I mean, I find there's such a worrying distortion of what it means to be a human being. And of course, the 18-year-old girl who does that, of course, they're warned over and over, but it seems as though it's the cool thing to do.
Is she empowered, Cathy, if she says she's empowered?
See, I'm really torn, and this is why I say I have great respect for what Clive's concerned about, because it concerns me too. But having been a teenage girl, unlike Clive, I will say that the greatest concern when I was a teenage girl was the sense of being stripped of agency when I had a sexuality, and which was not one which was highly endorsed in a working class beach culture, let me tell you, because I was skinny and brunette. But I did want a way to experiment with and express my sexual agency, and I think it's influenced my feminism. I understand Clive's concerns, and I think that he and I both are deeply concerned about the complexity of consent. And I think about this because I waded into the Bill Henson debate, and in fact, I'm looking to the side at a large Bill Henson photo I have on my wall, and I'm a Bill Henson fan. And I think what Bill Henson does in his artwork, and if people who are listening don't know of Bill Henson, he photographs naked adolescents, often prepubescent or just post-pubescent, male and female. And what's interesting to me is he's capturing a state of liminality, a state in which one doesn't quite know. I believe that teenagers and children, of course, but teenagers particularly, should be free to learn about their sexual identities and to play with their sense of sexual agency. And I know that that's a confronting thing for adults, and it's confronting when you have children. But I err on the side of saying education, work with them to have the right values when they're working through this very complicated business of being human. And it is complicated.
Oh, that's great, Cathy. I think it is. The uncomfortableness of being in that place of liminality is really the trick, isn't it? How can we sit in that place and be vulnerable?
Could you highlight maybe one issue in your life that has been extremely important to you, where you've changed your mind? Maybe we can start with you, Cathy, first, and then we'll move to Clive.
Okay, so I was in a marriage for 18 years, which ended 3 years ago. And my former partner's sister and her husband and her children are all very committed Christians.
Right.
Now, I was someone who had a real problem with religion, and despite the fact that pretty much all my male partners have been Jewish, and they've been culturally Jewish, not religiously Jewish generally. But I always had a kind of scathing opinion of religion and saw it as people who had an imaginary friend in the sky or some rubbish, right? And by getting to know these people who are like really dear to me and really important parts of my life, and also by listening to the Jewish partners I've had about the importance, I guess, of religion in a cultural sense, given the huge anti-Semitic forces we face, I guess that has changed my view of religion. And
Yeah.
it's made me understand that religion is very important in many people's lives, the rituals and all of these things, and that it can be an incredibly good force in the world. So I have dropped my prejudice, and I'm so much more empathetic to religious people.
So one last question to you. You've been pretty charitable in this podcast, and I can hear sort of the charitable side of you. How do you keep yourself charitable? What do you have to do when you're not feeling charitable?
Look at myself and ask the
Yeah.
people who love me to give me a critique. I do
Mm,
that quite often with my
mm,
partner
mm,
and with
mm,
my friends and my
mm,
kids. I tell
mm,
them, "Tell me what I'm doing wrong and how
mm,
can I
mm,
fix it?"
Okay, beautiful. Clive, how about you? Can we start with maybe a big issue that was very key in your life where you feel you've got that wrong?
Well, I wouldn't have thought of this except for Cathy staying to talk about it, but religion is a good one because for decades I was, not just I was a Dawkins type atheist before Dawkins came along. I used to grab students in the playground who were Christians and kind of harangue them on how silly they were, and then that kind of rationalist liberationist view was very much part of my political thinking and acting. I talked about taking my clothes off out of Jim Cairns's Confest, that kind of thing, and total sexual liberation and all of this, and very very down on Christians and Christianity. You can rehearse all of the arguments pretty easily, and then one day, completely out of the blue, I had this very very profound religious experience, uninvited, unanticipated, and it just knocked me out for years.
Can you tell us what it was?
No, but
Okay.
it happened, and I had to change all kinds of views. I stayed a person of the left, but I realised the complexity of the world, and I had a deeper insight into religion, religious experience, and what motivates people. And there's a kind of irony here. Here in my office, this office is located on the theology campus of Charles Sturt University, purely by accident because of my appointment. There was a spare office here, and originally I had one at ANU, and they said, "Oh, Clive, there's one over at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture." And I'm surrounded by theologians, and they are the most interesting, open-minded, and loving colleagues that I've ever had. And so I regard that as a great blessing, if I might use that word.
So, Clive, I have to ask you this question, and it's a little bit of a plug for I think your most recent book, which I think is called "The Hidden Hand: How the Chinese Communist Party is Reshaping the World." Do you think you could be charitable to the Chinese Communist Party?
Oh, certainly not. In no circumstances. I mean, it's a ruthless dictatorship that oppresses people and throws a million Uyghur people into concentration camps. How can you? It would be immoral to extend charity to the ruthless leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, and one can think of historical analogies there. But I mean, should you raise it? Because for me, up until 4 years ago, I was like everybody else pretty much on the left who had this kind of romantic hangover of Maoism and the great Chinese people and their revolution. And then I was confronted with a bunch of evidence. I thought, actually, no, look at what the Chinese Communist Party is and what it's doing. And I underwent a complete political transformation on that. And boy, have I lost a lot of friends as a result. Hamilton's become a racist. He's a xenophobe. The CIA has got to him, all kinds of accusations made against me. And I think, well, actually, all I've done is completely consistent with my fundamental principles, which is about the protection of human dignity, about the rights of human beings to go about their lives, about democratic practice and opposing authoritarian regimes. But there you go.
Fantastic.
Thanks so much to both of you.
Can I just say that's been fabulous? And Clive, can I say thank you for your generosity? And, it's really nice actually to have a face-to-face conversation with you because we've never really talked. We've just crossed paths in print. And
Indeed.
it's great to see you as a person.
Yeah, even if it's postage stamp size. Yeah, no, it's been really interesting. I've appreciated, and the spirit of generosity which Emile and Lloyd have set up for this discussion.
Thanks so much to you both.